The hum of the engines was a promise of departure, a metallic lullaby for the hundreds of souls strapped into their seats on Global Air Flight 214 from JFK to San Francisco. For 17-year-old Mira Ellison, it was the sound of opportunity carrying her toward the nation's most prestigious youth science symposium. But for flight attendant Bronwyn Hatcher, a woman teetering on the jagged edge of a 20-year career, it was the sound of a closing cage. In less than 10 minutes, one of these individuals would make a choice born of quiet dignity, and the other a shriek born of prejudice, a choice that would sever this metal bird from the sky before it ever had a chance to fly. A single 3-word sentence spoken into a phone would prove more powerful than a Boeing 777's twin engines, and the fallout would be anything but ordinary. The first-class cabin of Global Air Flight 214 was an oasis of beige leather and muted silver tones, a carefully constructed bubble of tranquility designed to insulate its occupants from the frantic energy of John F. Kennedy International Airport. Passengers settled in with the practiced ease of seasoned travelers, the soft rustle of newspapers, and the quiet clink of glasses, creating a gentle symphony of privilege. 17-year-old Mira Ellison, seated in 2B, was an island of focused calm amidst it all. Her almond-shaped eyes, dark and intelligent, scanned the final pages of a dense article on quantum entanglement in a peer-reviewed journal. She was not dressed to impress. She wore simple black jeans, a grey hoodie from her high school's physics club, and a pair of worn but clean sneakers. The only hint of luxury was the sleek, state-of-the-art laptop on her tray table. To a casual observer, she might have seemed out of place, a lucky recipient of an upgrade, or a child flying on a family member's miles. But Mira wasn't lucky. She was brilliant. Tucked carefully beneath the seat in front of her was a carbon fiber reinforced case about the size of a small violin case. It was matte black, unassuming, except for the small, discreet, biometric lock near the handle. Inside lay the culmination of 2 years of her life, a prototype for a miniaturized atmospheric water harvester that used a novel graphene oxide aerogel. This device was her ticket to the Sterling Symposium in San Francisco, a gathering of the nation's brightest young scientific minds. More than that, it was her passion, her creation, and she protected it with the fierce tenderness of a parent. The boarding process was nearing its end when Bronwyn Hatcher made her way through the first-class cabin. Bronwyn had been flying for 22 years. She had once loved the sky, the sense of adventure, the crisp snap of her uniform. Now the sky was just a hostile void, separating her from a life that felt increasingly disappointing. A mortgage that was underwater, a son who had recently dropped out of college, and a persistent grinding exhaustion had sanded away her professional veneer, leaving behind the raw nerves of resentment. She moved with a clipped, impatient energy, her smile a brittle facsimile plastered on her face. Her eyes, which missed nothing, immediately snagged on Mira. She saw a black teenager in a hoodie, sitting alone in a seat that cost more than Bronwyn's bi-weekly paycheck. An ugly, unbidden thought coiled in her mind. Another one. Probably some influencer or rapper's kid thinks the rules don't apply to her. Bronwyn stopped, her hip bumping against the armrest of the adjacent seat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little too loud in the quiet cabin. Mira looked up from her journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. She pulled out one of her earbuds. "I'm sorry. Your bag," Bronwyn said, pointing a manicured finger toward the case under the seat. "That can't stay there. It's blocking the space. It has to go in the overhead bin." Mira glanced down at the case. It was tucked as far under the seat as it could possibly go, her own feet angled to the side to accommodate it. It wasn't protruding into the aisle, or even into her own foot space, by any significant measure. "Oh, it's quite secure," Mira replied politely. "And it's fragile. It's my science project. I'd really prefer to keep it with me." "It's a standard-sized case," Bronwyn countered, her voice hardening. "The overhead bins are designed for them. That's what they're for." "I understand," Mira said, her tone still even. "But the components inside are very sensitive to shock and pressure changes. Being jostled around in the bin, especially if other bags are moved, could damage it. It fits perfectly fine right here." A man in his 50s in seat 3A, a seasoned executive named Mr. Peterson, glanced over. He could see the case clearly. It was in no one's way. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent signal to the flight attendant to let it go. Bronwyn ignored him. She saw Mira's calm response not as respectful disagreement, but as entitled defiance. The friction she felt in her own life was now finding a target. "Ma'am," she said, infusing the word with condescension. "FAA regulations are not a negotiation. All larger carry-on items must be stowed overhead for takeoff. No exceptions." This was a lie, or at least a gross exaggeration. Personal items which the case could easily qualify as were permitted under the seat. But Bronwyn was no longer operating on FAA regulations. She was operating on her own internal, soured script. Mira took a slow breath, the kind her father had taught her to take when confronted with irrationality. "With all due respect, this qualifies as a personal item, and it isn't obstructing any egress. I've flown with it like this several times before on this airline. Could you perhaps check with the purser or the captain, if you're unsure?" The suggestion that she, a veteran flight attendant, was unsure was like a spark on dry tinder. Bronwyn's fake smile vanished, completely replaced by a tight, angry line. "Are you telling me how to do my job? I've been flying since before you were born, young lady. The bag goes up. Now." The politeness in Mira's demeanor finally began to recede, replaced by a cool firmness. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "It stays here." The cabin, once a hum of quiet activity, was now utterly silent. Every eye was on the unfolding drama. Mr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd seen flight attendants on a power trip before, but this was different. There was a personal animus in the woman's tone, a venom that was entirely out of proportion to the situation. The confrontation had passed the point of a simple baggage dispute. It had become a battle of wills, and Bronwyn Hatcher was about to detonate. Bronwyn Hatcher felt a hot surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about a bag anymore. It was about respect. It was about the slow erosion of her authority, her life being personified by this quiet, defiant girl in a hoodie. In her mind, Mira was a symbol of everything she couldn't control. "What did you just say to me?" Bronwyn's voice was no longer just loud. It was sharp, cracking the curated calm of the first-class cabin like a whip. Mira held her gaze, her own expression hardening into one of resolute defense. "I said no. This case contains delicate scientific equipment. It is not going in the overhead bin. It is safely stowed and is not a hazard. I am not going to argue about it any further." The finality in Mira's tone was too much for Bronwyn's frayed composure. She felt the eyes of the other passengers on her, pitying, annoyed, judgmental. She felt cornered, and like a cornered animal, she lashed out. "You think because you're sitting in this cabin, you can make up your own rules?" Bronwyn's voice rose in pitch, taking on a shrill, accusatory edge. "I don't know how you even got a ticket for this seat. But let me tell you something, the rules apply to everyone, even you." The "even you" hung in the air, thick and poisoned. It was a loaded phrase, and everyone in the cabin understood its ugly subtext. Mr. Peterson flinched. A woman across the aisle put down her magazine, her mouth slightly agape. The implication was clear. You, a young black girl, don't belong here, and you certainly don't get to defy me. Mira's jaw tightened. The quiet hurt was there, a familiar sting, but it was quickly eclipsed by a cold, clear anger. She had faced this kind of thing before, the subtle and not so subtle challenges to her presence in spaces where people like her were underrepresented in advanced placement classes, at science fairs, and now apparently in first class. My ticket was purchased the same way as everyone else's, Mira stated, her voice dangerously calm. And my presence here doesn't give you the right to harass me. You are creating a disturbance. I've given you a reasonable explanation. If you have an issue, please get your supervisor. This was a critical mistake on Mira's part, not because she was wrong, but because she was logical. Bronwyn was far beyond logic. The request for a supervisor was interpreted as a direct attack on her competence. I am the authority here, Bronwyn shouted, her face reddening. She took a step closer, leaning over Mira, invading her personal space. The scent of stale coffee and hairspray was overwhelming. You are a non-compliant passenger. I have told you, not asked you, told you to move that bag. You have two choices. Put the bag in the overhead compartment, or I will have you removed from this aircraft. The threat was absurd. The plane was fully boarded. The cabin door was sealed, and they were moments from pushback. Removing a passenger now would cause a significant delay and a logistical nightmare. It was a bluff born of pure rage. Mira didn't flinch. She simply looked at Bronwyn, her eyes holding a depth of disappointment that was more piercing than any insult. She saw a woman unraveling a professional in complete meltdown, and she knew that any further attempt at rational conversation was pointless. That's your final word? Mira asked, her voice barely a whisper. You're darn right it is, Bronwyn snapped, jabbing a finger toward the overhead bin. Up now, or you're getting off this plane. The cabin was electric with tension. Mr. Peterson, unable to remain silent any longer, finally spoke up. Ma'am, for heaven's sake, he said, his voice resonating with weary authority. The girl is not causing a problem. Her bag is not in the way. You are the one causing a scene. Leave her alone so we can get on our way. Bronwyn whirled on him, her fury now redirected. Sir, this is a crew matter. Stay out of it or I'll have you written up for interference. It was a ridiculous threat, and it was the last straw. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure. The finality of the announcement should have ended the confrontation. For Bronwyn, it was a ticking clock. She turned back to Mira, her eyes wild. Last chance. Move it. Mira looked at the distraught woman in front of her. She looked at the concerned faces of the other passengers. She looked down at the carbon fiber case that held her future. Then she did something no one expected. She didn't move the bag. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She slowly reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out her smartphone. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She unlocked the screen, her thumb hovering for a moment over her contacts. Bronwyn let out a short, derisive laugh. Oh, what are you going to do? Call your mummy, tweet about it, I don't care. Security will be waiting for you at the gate. Mira ignored her. She found the contact she was looking for. It was listed simply as Dad. She pressed the call button. As the phone began to ring, she looked up, meeting Bronwyn's furious gaze with an expression of profound, unshakable sorrow. You have no idea, Mira said softly, just as a voice answered on the other end of the line. You have no idea what you've just done. The voice that answered on the other end of the line was calm, deep, and accustomed to command. Mira, you should be taking off. Is everything okay? Bronwyn folded her arms, a smirk playing on her lips. The act of defiance was pathetic in her eyes. The plane had begun its slow, powerful pushback from the gate. The low groan of the tug's engine was a clear signal the matter was over. The girl had lost. "Dad," Mira said, her voice perfectly steady, betraying none of the turmoil she felt. "It's happening again." 3 simple words. Not "a flight attendant is yelling at me." Not "I'm being kicked off a plane." Just "it's happening again." This was a coded message, a phrase steeped in a history of shared experiences, of navigating a world that too often saw her as a threat before it saw her as a person. There was a pause on the other end of the line, pregnant with weight. The calm voice sharpened, shedding its paternal warmth and taking on the incisive edge of a surgeon's scalpel. "Give me the flight number and the employee's name." "Global Air Flight 214 to SFO." Mira recited, her eyes never leaving Bronwyn's. "The flight attendant's name is Bronwyn Hatcher. Brenda. Hatcher. She spelled it out with chilling precision. Bronwyn's smirk faltered. There was a coldness in the girl's delivery that unnerved her. This wasn't the sound of a teenager complaining to her father. This was the sound of a report being filed. "Understood," the voice on the phone said. "Put your phone on speaker, Mira. Let Miss Hatcher and I have a word." Mira's thumb moved to the speaker icon. "He wants to talk to you," she said to Bronwyn, her expression unreadable. Bronwyn scoffed. "I'm not talking to your father. This is between you and me, and it's over. Now turn off that phone. We're on an active taxiway." "I think you should listen," Mira advised quietly. Before Bronwyn could retort, the man's voice filled the small space around seat 2B. It wasn't loud, but it had a resonant authority that cut through the low hum of the cabin. "This is Robert Ellison," the voice said. "Am I speaking with Bronwyn Hatcher?" The name meant nothing to Bronwyn, but to Mr. Peterson in 3A, who worked in finance, the name landed like a physical blow. His eyes widened. Robert Ellison, the founding partner and CEO of Ares Capital, partners one of the most powerful private equity firms in the world. The man whose company had orchestrated the multi-billion-dollar leveraged buyout of global airlines 3 years prior. Mr. Peterson suddenly felt very cold. He wasn't just a shareholder. For all intents and purposes, he owned the airline. "This is a sterile cockpit environment," Bronwyn snapped back, falling back on procedure, her voice a little less certain now. "All cellular devices must be turned off." "Ms. Hatcher," Robert Ellison's voice was glacially calm, "you have accused my daughter of being a non-compliant passenger and have threatened to have her removed from the aircraft over a properly stowed piece of carry-on luggage. Is that correct?" Bronwyn was flustered. "Sir, you don't understand the situation." "I understand perfectly. I'm looking at the passenger manifest Mira's ticket purchase history and the seating chart for Flight 214 as we speak. I also understand Section 14, Subsection C of the Global Air Customer Bill of Rights, which my team personally drafted. What I don't understand is why you believe your employment with this company will continue past the next 5 minutes." The pushback had stopped. The gentle backward motion of the massive aircraft ceased abruptly with a slight shudder. Outside the window, the ground crew, which had been walking alongside the wing, paused and looked toward the cockpit. A confused murmur rippled through the entire plane. The captain's voice came over the intercom, tight and confused. "Tower Global 214, we're holding position on the taxiway. Stand by." Bronwyn's blood ran cold. The coincidence was impossible. Her mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. The name, the sudden halt of the aircraft. It couldn't be. My daughter Mira. Robert Ellison continued, his voice, now devoid of any emotion whatsoever. Is a 17-year-old girl traveling to present her research at a symposium that she was invited to by 2 Nobel laureates. The case you are harassing her about contains a prototype that is arguably more valuable than your entire plane. But that is irrelevant. What is relevant is your conduct. You have racially profiled a minor, created a hostile environment, and publicly humiliated a first-class passenger. You have become a liability to my airline. My airline. The 2 words echoed in the deafening silence around seat 2B. Bronwyn's face went white. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. The rage, the resentment, the self-righteous fury, it all evaporated, replaced by a wave of pure, gut-wrenching terror. She looked at Mira, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not an entitled teenager, but the progeny of a titan, a girl who wielded a power Bronwyn couldn't even comprehend. "Mira," Robert's voice commanded, "give the phone to the lead flight attendant, the purser." Mira stood and walked the few steps to the forward galley, where the other flight attendants were huddled, whispering and staring. She handed the phone to the purser, a man named George, whose face was a mask of confusion. George hesitantly took the phone. "Hello. George Bess." Robert Ellison said the name read from a file he now had open on his screen. "This is Robert Ellison. I am the primary stakeholder for Global Air. Your aircraft is not to move another inch. You will return to the gate immediately. A corporate liaison is already en route. And you will inform Captain Davies that he is to await my direct instruction. Is that clear?" George's eyes bulged. He looked from the phone to Bronwyn, who now stood swaying in the aisle, her face a mask of horror. He looked at Mira, who had returned to her seat and was calmly placing her journal back in her bag. Yes, sir," George stammered. "Crystal clear." He turned and practically ran to the cockpit door. A moment later, the captain's voice filled the cabin again, but this time it was strained, tense, and utterly bewildered. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. It appears we have to return to the gate due to an unforeseen crew issue. We apologize for the delay and will provide more information as soon as we have it." The engines whined as they changed pitch. The Boeing 777, a marvel of modern engineering, began to move again, not forward toward the sky, but backward in a slow, humiliating retreat to the terminal it had just left. The flight was over before it had even begun, and Bronwyn Hatcher's life was about to be grounded permanently. The slow crawl back to the gate was the most agonizing 10 minutes of Bronwyn Hatcher's life. The other flight attendants avoided her gaze, moving about the cabin with a forced, brittle professionalism, their whispers ceasing the moment she looked their way. The passengers were a sea of confused and angry faces, their quiet grumbling growing into a chorus of frustration. They didn't know the cause, but Bronwyn did. She stood frozen in the galley, the full weight of her catastrophic miscalculation pressing down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. She watched Mira Ellison, who was now staring out the window, her expression serene, as if watching a passing cloud. The girl's terrifying composure was the most damning indictment of all. She hadn't screamed or thrown a tantrum. She had simply made a call, a single surgical strike that had severed the flight's lifeline. The moment the jet bridge reconnected to the aircraft with a solid final thump, the cabin door was opened. It wasn't the usual gate agent who stood there. It was 3 people in sharp, dark suits. One of them, a stern-faced man with silver hair, scanned the cabin, his eyes landing on the purser, George, who pointed a trembling finger toward Bronwyn. But before they moved toward her, the man's gaze found Mira. He approached seat 2B and bent down slightly, his voice a respectful murmur. Ms. Ellison, I'm David Conrad, Vice President of In-Flight Services. Your father sent me. We have a private lounge ready for you, and a new aircraft is being prepared. We sincerely apologize for this experience." Mira simply nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Conrad." Conrad then turned to Mr. Peterson in 3A. "Sir, you are Mr. Peterson. We were informed you witnessed the incident. Would you be willing to provide a statement?" Mr. Peterson, who looked as though he'd just seen a ghost, unbuckled his seatbelt. "I'd be glad to. What I saw was an absolute disgrace." Conrad nodded grimly. He and 2 other corporate agents escorted Mara and Mr. Peterson off the plane, treating them with the deference usually reserved for visiting royalty. The other passengers watched their curiosity now mixed with awe and a dawning understanding that this was no ordinary delay. Only then did the remaining agent, a woman with a cold, impassive face, turn to Bronwyn. "Ms. Hatcher, please collect your personal belongings. You'll be coming with me." There was no negotiation in her tone. It was an order. Bronwyn moved as if in a trance, her hands shaking as she retrieved her purse from a storage compartment. Every step she took down the aisle was a walk of shame. The eyes of her colleagues and the passengers burned into her back. The career she had built over 2 decades, the identity that had defined her adult life, was dissolving in real time. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the world she knew ended. Back on the plane, the situation descended into managed chaos. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his face grim. He announced that due to a sudden and unavoidable crew resourcing issue, Flight 214 to San Francisco was officially cancelled. A collective groan of outrage swept through the aircraft. Passengers were being rebooked, but for many it would mean hours of delays, missed connections, and ruined plans. Their anger was a palpable force, but it was aimed at the anonymous entity of the airline, unaware that the catalyst for their misery was a single furious woman who had picked the wrong teenager to bully. Meanwhile, in the tranquil, soundproofed luxury of the Global Air flagship lounge, a very different scene was unfolding. Myra sat on a plush sofa, sipping a bottle of water, while Mr. Peterson gave his statement to a corporate lawyer who was taking furious notes. And then she screamed at the girl. "I don't know how you even got a ticket for this seat." Mr. Peterson recounted, his voice filled with indignation. The racial undertones were not subtle. They were blatant. The young lady handled herself with more grace than I could have mustered. The flight attendant was completely unhinged. On a large screen on the wall, a video call was active. Robert Ellison's face, etched with a controlled fury, filled the display. He listened intently, his expression unmoving, but his eyes were like chips of obsidian. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," Robert said when the man had finished. "Your testimony is invaluable. My team will handle your rebooking and ensure you are compensated for your time and the disruption. We appreciate your integrity." Mr. Peterson simply nodded. Any decent person would have done the same. After he was escorted to another part of the lounge, Robert's attention focused solely on his daughter. The corporate titan vanished, and a father's concern broke through. "Are you all right, Mira?" "I'm fine, Dad," she said, though her voice was a little shaky now that the adrenaline was fading. "Just tired of it." "I know," he said softly, "and I'm sorry you have to be. But you did the right thing. You never raise your voice. You never lose your cool. You simply make the call. We've practiced this." "I know," she repeated. "It just shouldn't be necessary." "No, it shouldn't," he agreed, a hard edge returning to his voice. "And that's why we're not just going to let this go. Mr. Conrad," he said, addressing the VP, who stood silently in the corner of the room, "what is Ms. Hatcher's status?" Conrad cleared his throat, visibly sweating under his boss's virtual gaze. She has been suspended indefinitely pending a full investigation. Her credentials have been revoked, and she has been escorted from airport property. Indefinitely is not good enough, David, Robert snapped. She threatened a minor on my aircraft. She publicly displayed racial bias while wearing your uniform. She is a multi-million-dollar lawsuit waiting to happen. She is to be terminated. For cause. I want her file on my desk in 1 hour. Yes, Mr. Ellison. Furthermore, Robert continued his voice, dropping to a dangerously low level. I want a full review of your diversity and inclusion training protocols. All of them. The ones my team mandated 3 years ago. I want to know who is running them, what their efficacy rates are, and why they are so clearly failing. This incident is not a single bad apple. It's a symptom of a diseased tree, and I want to know how deep the rot goes. David Conrad looked like he was about to be physically ill. We will begin the review immediately, sir. The grounding of Flight 214 was no longer just about one flight attendant. It was escalating into a full-blown corporate crisis instigated by one man's will and the single call his daughter had made. A new plane was being brought to the gate, a fresh crew assembled. Mira would get to her symposium. But for Global Air and especially for Bronwyn Hatcher, the turbulence was just beginning. The news of Flight 214's cancellation and the bizarre circumstances surrounding it spread through the airline's corporate headquarters in Chicago like a shock wave. It wasn't just a rumor, it was a 5-alarm fire, because the name Robert Ellison was attached to it. He wasn't just an investor, he was the apex predator in their ecosystem. His firm Ori's Capital had been the financial muscle behind the airline's restructuring, saving it from bankruptcy. They held 2 seats on the board and controlled a 30% stake. When Robert Ellison had a problem, the entire C-suite had a problem. In a sterile, windowless room in the airport's administrative wing, Bronwyn Hatcher sat across a metal table from David Conrad and the impassive corporate lawyer. With her was Frank, her union representative, a portly man with a weary expression who had seen dozens of these meetings before. Usually he could bully or bargain his way to a suspension or a retraining mandate. This time felt different. It was a misunderstanding. Bronwyn began, her voice hoarse. The passenger was refusing to follow standard safety procedures. Her bag was an obstruction. I was following my training. The lawyer, a woman named Ms. Chen, looked up from her tablet without a flicker of emotion. We have a sworn statement from passenger Daniel Peterson in seat 3A. He attests that the bag was in no way an obstruction and was tucked securely under the seat. We also have preliminary notes from interviews with 2 other first-class passengers who corroborate his account. Furthermore, we have your entire employment file, Ms. Hatcher. Ms. Chen swiped on her screen. In the last 5 years, you have been the subject of 8 formal passenger complaints. 6 of them mention rude and aggressive behavior. 2 of those specifically mention altercations with minority passengers. While none of them resulted in formal disciplinary action beyond a note in your file, they establish a clear pattern of conduct. Frank, the union rep, jumped in. A pattern of a dedicated, long-serving employee dealing with the increasing stress of this job. 8 complaints in 5 years is nothing. She flies hundreds of routes a year. What is not nothing? Frank Conrad interjected, his voice sharp with stress, is that she verbally accosted the daughter of the man who owns 1/3 of this company. She did it loudly, publicly, and with what multiple witnesses are calling clear racial animus. She grounded a 777 full of 300 passengers and caused a logistical and PR catastrophe that we are still trying to contain. Bronwyn's facade of defense crumbled. He called me, on the plane. She whispered, the memory still seeming surreal. "He called me on her phone." Ms. Chen leaned forward. "Let's talk about that. When you realized who you were speaking with, what was your reaction?" I was enforcing the sterile cockpit rule," Bronwyn stammered. "Cell phone use is prohibited." "You were in the middle of a verbal tirade on the taxiway, Ms. Hatcher," Chen said coldly. "The sterile cockpit rule was the least of your violations at that point. You showed no de-escalation skills. You showed no contrition. You doubled down on your aggression. You gave us, the airline, no room to defend you." Frank tried to argue. He brought up her 22 years of service, her clean safety record, the lack of physical contact. But his words were like pebbles against a tidal wave. The decision had already been made in a boardroom 800 miles away. "Your employment with Global Air is terminated effective immediately," Conrad said, the words falling like a judge's gavel, "for gross misconduct and violation of the company's code of conduct. The union can file a grievance, but I will tell you right now, Frank, we will fight it with the full resources of this corporation. We will bring in every witness. We will spare no expense. It is not a fight you can win." Bronwyn stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently. 22 years. Her pension, her flight benefits, her health insurance. Her entire life was built around this job. It was all gone. In the span of an hour, she had gone from a position of authority to unemployed. She felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, the fluorescent lights of the small room seeming to pulse and dim. Meanwhile, the story was beginning to leak. Not from the airline, which was in full lockdown mode, but from the passengers of Flight 214. Dozens of them, delayed for hours, took to social media. Tweets and Facebook posts started to circulate. "Stuck at JFK. Global Air flight to SFO cancelled after they got back to the gate. Rumor is a flight attendant had a meltdown in first class. Craziest thing just happened. This flight attendant started screaming at a young girl, and next thing you know, the whole plane is grounded." Global Air, Wyong's JFK. The story was disjointed, pieced together from hearsay. No one knew Mira's name or the true identity of her father. But the narrative was forming an abusive flight attendant and a mysterious, powerful passenger. The internet, with its insatiable appetite for drama, was taking notice. A small fire had been lit, and it was threatening to become an inferno. Back in the lounge, Myra was on her new flight, a half-empty plane that had been hastily commissioned just for her and a handful of other high-priority passengers from the cancelled flight. She finally landed in San Francisco, tired but safe. Her father had arranged for a car to take her directly to her hotel. Before she hung up, he had one last thing to say. "Mira, I'm proud of you. But I want to be clear. This isn't just about punishing one person. A system that allows a woman like that to hold a position of authority for 22 years, despite a clear pattern of behavior, is a broken system. I'm not just firing her. I'm fixing the system. This will not happen to someone else, I promise." Mira knew he meant it. Her father didn't make idle threats or empty promises. When he identified a flaw in a system, he dismantled it and rebuilt it to his specifications. The karma that was coming for Bronwyn Hatcher was only the beginning. A much larger, more impersonal form of reckoning was about to befall the airline she had worked for. The termination was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a cold, administrative execution. After the meeting, Bronwyn was escorted to her crew locker by a silent security guard. Her hands trembled as she packed away 22 years of her life into a cardboard box, a collection of commemorative pins from inaugural flights, a faded photo of her son as a boy tucked into the locker door, a spare pair of sensible shoes. Each object was a ghost of a life that no longer existed. The final indignity was handing over her ID badge, the plastic card which had given her access to airports and aircraft across the globe was now just a worthless piece of plastic. As she slid it across the counter to the impassive HR manager, she felt a fundamental part of herself being surrendered with it. The walk through the terminal, stripped of her uniform and authority, was excruciating. She was just another civilian, invisible and insignificant in the very halls where she once strode with purpose. Her union representative Frank had called that evening. His voice, usually a booming instrument of feigned outrage on behalf of his members, was flat and tired. "We've filed the grievance, Bronwyn," he'd said the words hollow. "But I have to be honest with you. The name Ellison carries a lot of weight. They're citing a pattern of complaints and bringing in multiple witnesses. They're painting this as a multi-million-dollar liability. It's a steep climb." Bronwyn understood the subtext perfectly. The union would go through the motions, but she was a lost cause, an acceptable sacrifice to appease an overwhelmingly powerful force. She was on her own. The chill from the corporate world followed her home, seeping into the foundations of her personal life. Her husband, Mark, who worked as a regional sales manager for a struggling paper company, was home when she arrived. He saw the box in her hands and the shattered look on her face. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Through choked sobs, she recounted the story, editing it to cast herself in the most favorable light. She spoke of an entitled non-compliant passenger, of FAA regulations of her authority being challenged, but the narrative fell apart when she got to the part about the phone call. "Wait," Mark interrupted, his face paling. "Robert Ellison, the Robert Ellison, from Ares Capital. That's whose daughter it was." "How was I supposed to know?" Bronwyn cried, her voice cracking. "She was just a kid in a hoodie." Mark sank into a kitchen chair, running his hands through his thinning hair. His fear quickly curdled into a furious, desperate anger. "How could you be so stupid?" "Bronwyn," he exploded, his voice a harsh rasp. "Screaming at a passenger in first class. What were you thinking? We have a mortgage. My commissions have been down for 6 months straight. Your job was the only stable thing we had." His tirade wasn't about the injustice or her humiliation. It was about the sudden, terrifying crater that had opened in their financial security. The fight that followed was biblical, a brutal dredging up of every disappointment and resentment that had simmered between them for years. That night, for the first time in their marriage, he took a pillow and blanket and went to the couch. The silence that filled the house was heavier and more suffocating than any argument. Her son, Kevin, who was home from the community college he was now attending, offered even less solace. He found her the next day, sitting in the darkened living room. He didn't ask what was wrong. He already knew. He held up his phone. "Is this you?" On the screen was a 45-second video, shaky and chaotic. It was her face twisted into a mask of rage she didn't recognize, was visible for all the world to see. The audio was clear enough to catch the most damning line. "The rules apply to everyone, even you." It had been posted by a passenger from the flight, and it was spreading like a virus. "They're calling you Global Air Karen," Kevin said, his tone a mixture of morbid fascination and deep embarrassment. "It has like 2 million views." Bronwyn felt the blood drain from her face. "Take that down, I don't want to see it." Kevin just shrugged his detachment, a form of cruelty. "So you got fired for being a Karen classic." He turned and walked away, leaving Bronwyn alone with the vibrating, malevolent glow of the screen. That was the beginning of the digital deluge. The clip migrated from TikTok to Twitter, where the hashtags Jahreszach Flight Attendant Karen and Horror's Global Air Meltdown trended for 2 solid days. Anonymous internet sleuths with terrifying efficiency, pieced together her identity. Within 48 hours, her full name, her general location, and a picture of her house taken from a real estate website were circulating online. The doxing began. Threatening emails filled an old account she barely used. Their landline, which they kept for emergencies, rang at all hours with callers who would either breathe heavily or scream obscenities. A local news van idled on their street for an entire afternoon, a silent, predatory presence. Bronwyn became a prisoner in her own home, peeking through the blinds at a world that now held her in contempt, her anxiety, a constant metallic taste in her mouth. In the depths of her shame, she held on to one last bitter justification. She had been provoked by a spoiled, entitled rich kid. She imagined the girl Mira laughing about the incident, recounting to her friends how her powerful father had smote the lowly flight attendant. This imagined narrative was the only thing protecting the fragile remnant of her pride. Weeks later, that last defense was systematically dismantled. It was late, the house was silent, and Bronwyn was engaged in the self-flagellating ritual of scrolling through the news on her laptop. She clicked on a link to a popular science and technology site. A headline at the top of the page caught her eye: "Teenage Genius Reinvents Water Scarcity Solutions at Sterling Symposium." She clicked, not knowing why. And there she was. The photo showed the girl from the plane, Mira Ellison. But this was not the defiant teenager from her memory. This Mira was standing on a stage, beaming her intelligent eyes, bright with joy. She was holding a large, ornate plaque, flanked by two smiling elderly men whom the caption identified as Nobel laureates. Bronwyn's eyes scanned the article, her heart beginning to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. It detailed Mira's project, a miniaturized atmospheric water harvester. It spoke of a novel graphene oxide aerogel of unprecedented efficiency, of potential applications that could bring clean drinking water to arid regions around the world. The article quoted one of the judges, a professor from MIT, who called Mira's work the most promising leap in this field in a decade. It mentioned her top prize, a $50,000 scholarship, and a coveted internship. Bronwyn stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to reconcile the two images of Mira. The girl she had tried to eject from the plane was not a spoiled brat. She was a prodigy. The carbon fiber case she had screamed about was not a simple piece of luggage. It contained a device that could save lives, a prototype born from years of dedication and brilliance. The full crushing weight of her misjudgment descended upon her. It was a physical sensation, a hollowing out of her chest. Her prejudice had not just been ugly or unprofessional. It had been catastrophically, demonstrably wrong. She had looked at brilliance and seen entitlement. She had looked at a dedicated scientist and seen a troublemaker. She had faced the future and, in a fit of bitter, ignorant rage, tried to shove it in an overhead bin. The shame that washed over her was absolute. It was a far greater punishment than the loss of her job or the jeers of the internet mob. This was the intimate internal karma of knowing with sickening certainty that the ugliness she had perceived that day was not in the young woman in seat 2B, but a reflection of the barren, resentful person she herself had become. Robert Ellison was a man who believed in levers. Find the right lever, and you could move the world, or at the very least, a multi-billion-dollar airline. Bronwyn Hatcher's termination was not the lever. It was merely the removal of a rusty, broken cog. The real work began in the weeks that followed. He called an emergency meeting of the Global Air Board of Directors. It was less of a meeting and more of a decree. His presentation was cold, analytical, and brutal. He laid out the events of Flight 243 not as an emotional father, but as the company's largest and most important stakeholder. This was not an isolated incident. He stated a slide appearing behind him, showing the statistics on passenger complaints correlated by race. It was a predictable outcome of a corporate culture that pays lip service to diversity, but fails in its implementation. Our training is ineffective. Our complaint resolution process is toothless. Our management oversight is negligent. We are flying blind into a storm of social and legal liability. He presented his terms. They were not suggestions. First, David Conrad, the VP of In-Flight Services, was to be reassigned. He had overseen a department where a pattern of conduct like Bronwyn Hatcher's could go unchecked for years. He would be replaced by a candidate from outside the company, a DEI specialist with a proven track record of implementing systemic change. Second, the airline's entire diversity, equity, and inclusion training program was to be scrapped. In its place, Ares Capital would bring in a top-tier consulting firm to design a new program from the ground up. It would be mandatory for all employees, from baggage handlers to the CEO. It would involve rigorous scenario-based training, implicit bias testing, and de-escalation techniques. Completion would be tied to performance reviews and promotions. Third, a new independent passenger advocacy office was to be created. It would report directly to the board, not to the corporate chain of command. This office would have the power to investigate any passenger complaint of discrimination, with full access to personnel files, and the authority to recommend disciplinary action up to and including termination. The board, faced with the undisguised threat of Ares Capital divesting its massive stake, agreed to everything. The cost of implementation would be immense, but the cost of inaction, as Robert Ellison made clear, would be catastrophic. The ripples spread throughout the entire company. Memos were sent. Town halls were held. A great lumbering corporate beast was being forcibly evolved. The real twist, the final turn of the screw, was not corporate, but deeply personal. 6 months after the incident, Bronwyn Hatcher was working as a cashier at a large, brightly lit supermarket. The pay was a fraction of what she used to make. The hours were grueling, and the work was monotonous. The condescending looks and impatient sighs from customers were a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. She was invisible, just another cog in a different, much less glamorous machine. One afternoon, a woman came through her checkout line. She was well-dressed professional with a kind but serious face. Bronwyn scanned her items: organic kale, artisanal cheese, a bottle of expensive wine. As the woman went to pay, she looked up, and her eyes met Bronwyn's. There was a flicker of recognition. It was Ms. Chen, the lawyer from Global Air. Bronwyn froze her hand, hovering over the scanner. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She expected a smirk, a look of triumph, anything. Instead, Ms. Chen's expression softened into one of mild surprise, followed by something that looked almost like pity. She said nothing about the incident. She didn't acknowledge their history. She simply completed her transaction, smiled a polite, generic smile, and said, "Have a nice day." As Ms. Chen walked away, pushing her cart toward the exit, Bronwyn felt the final crushing weight of her new reality. She wasn't a villain anymore. She wasn't a meme. She was nothing. Her great dramatic downfall had ended here, under the fluorescent lights of a grocery store, being granted the mercy of anonymity by one of the architects of her ruin. The lack of confrontation was a louder statement than any public rebuke. It meant she was no longer relevant. She no longer mattered. The hard karma wasn't just about losing her job and her reputation. It was about being stripped of the identity and authority she had misused so profoundly, left with only the quiet, humbling reality of a life she had to rebuild from scratch, haunted by the memory of a calm 17-year-old girl and a single phone call that had sent her world into a permanent, irreversible descent. The story of Mira Ellison and Bronwyn Hatcher serves as a powerful real-world lesson in cause and effect. It's a stark reminder that our actions, especially those fueled by prejudice and a thirst for power, can have consequences that ripple far beyond a single moment. One person's quiet dignity in the face of aggression, combined with the power to demand accountability, didn't just alter the course of a flight. It forced an entire corporation to confront the rot within its own culture. Bronwyn Hatcher's downfall wasn't just karma. It was the inevitable outcome of a system being held to account by a force it could not ignore. This story shows that the most powerful response to injustice isn't always the loudest shout, but sometimes it's the most strategic call. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories of drama, justice, and the unexpected twists of life. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update.